Hello. How is everyone doing tonight? Oh, wow. Excellent. I'm glad that the weather doesn't have you guys down. All right. Well, I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. And again, I want to say hello to everyone here today and those of you who are watching online. There are many things that you can do with your time, so we're grateful you chose to spend it here. I am so pleased to introduce one of the most influential science writers publishing today, Dava Sobel. Author of numerous critically acclaimed books on the history of science, she is known for her unique ability to combine scientific adventure with the human dramas that propel them forward. Her books have been translated into 24 foreign languages and have landed on national and international best-selling lists alike. She is here with award-winning scientist, journalist, Angela Saini. Her latest book, The Patriarchs, How Men Came to Rule, is a groundbreaking exploration of the origins of patriarchy. Also received numerous awards and accolades, and we're very lucky to have them both here today. And you can also find their full bios in your printed program or on the event listing on the website. So to tell you more about Dava Sobel's The Elements of Marie Curie, it is much more than a biography. While it is, on one hand, an exploration of the science of chemistry and the history of radium, it is also a tribute to the pioneering women who joined Marie Curie in her Paris laboratory. Many of them would later go on to chart their own paths in radiochemistry and atomic physics. For women in science, Marie Curie really did redefine what was possible. Dava's book is available for purchase for those of you in this room and through our online shop. For those of you attending virtually, whichever way you purchase it, and please do if you are able, proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. And for those of you here tonight, there will be a signing after the event. And for you online folks, if you need a link to purchase, we'll put it in the chat now if we haven't already. And of course, if you have a New York Public Library card, you can borrow it for free. So before I turn it over, if I can keep you for another minute, I have a couple announcements. We are closing out the year with one of our favorite events, Library After Hours, this Friday, December 13th. Come celebrate 100 years of James Baldwin in this building-wide takeover, featuring a display of rare manuscripts and photographs by and of James Baldwin, films, live music by Candace Hoyes, and other special guests, including Phoebe Robinson, Tyree Jones, and Daryl Pinckney. So this Library After Hours edition is tied to the exhibition, Jimmy, God's Black Revolutionary Mouth, currently on view at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. If you can't make it this Friday, you still have time to catch the exhibition on view until February 28th of next year at the Schomburg Center. I highly recommend it. And we will be taking a short hiatus after the holidays, but we'll be back early next spring with some fantastic talks and events, including Jennifer Finney Boylan's new book and a special collaboration with the Met Opera for their adaptation of Moby Dick. But if you think you're going to miss these talks before the new year and are hungry for more content, please subscribe to our podcast, Library Talks, which features talks from our past favorite live events, as well as other library programs from around the system. So you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Play. And if I can make one more shameless plug, if you'd like to be the first to know about our events and how to register, please subscribe to our newsletter at nypl.org/nyplconnect. So one last thing, you should have received an index card when you came into the auditorium. Please use these cards for writing questions. You'll see a staff member come around and collect them during the program. And finally, Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. And of course, by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends near and far. Thank you for that support, and thank you again for being here. And with that, let's please welcome Dava Sobel and Angela Saini.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled, personally, because I'm a big fan of Dava. She's done something remarkable with this new book. She describes people's life stories as beautifully as she does the science. This is an astoundingly readable, genuinely gripping book. And more importantly, it gives a fresh window on someone we think we know so well, But actually, even when I read it, and I thought I knew Marie Curie really well, I learned so much I had no idea about. Marie Curie is the one person most people name when we're asked to think of a famous scientist, regardless of sex. You know, Marie Curie is right up there. She was the first woman in France to receive a PhD in physics, a winner of 2 Nobel Prizes. She remains an inspiration to so many. But as this book so vividly reveals, she also played an important part in the careers of other brilliant women of her time. So, Dava, it's a pleasure to have you here. I just want to start by saying I was in Warsaw not that long ago, and I recall being told off constantly by people for calling her Marie Curie. Everyone said, no, she's Maria Skłodowska. And they were very insistent. And as you show from the beginning, she always loved Poland. She had an affection for it right until the end. And that never really went away, did it?
No, she felt very proudly and fiercely Polish. I think especially because throughout her childhood and into her adulthood, Poland was not a country. It had been taken over, and the part where she lived in Warsaw was under Russian control. And that really affected her life. She was not allowed to speak Polish outside her home in a few safe places. And that sense stayed with her. She had a very great love for Polish culture.
Now, when Marie Curie herself, and this is a very interesting little tidbit that you have in your book, when she was asked to write her biography towards the end of her life, she said her life story could be summed up in a single paragraph. I was born in Warsaw of a family of teachers. I married Pierre Curie and had 2 children. I've done my work in France. Full stop.
Period. Yes.
That's it. I mean, how do you start a biography of someone like this? She's such a remarkable character, but so self-effacing. What material is there about her?
Well, I like what her daughter said. Her daughter wrote the first biography of her and said that there were so many great moments in her mother's life that one is tempted to tell her story as a legend. And I feel that's closer to the truth than Marie's own evaluation of herself. But I was interested in the idea of the other women. So to prepare to tell that story, I read all the biographies of her. And then I convinced myself that everybody already knew the facts of her life, and I was just going to talk about the women. And I actually wrote the first 5 chapters that way, and my editor said, no, this isn't working at all. you have to start with her and then bring the others in. So that was good advice, and I was glad that I had done only 5 chapters and not a whole book, as had happened on other occasions. So, yeah.
So just let's start then with her life. She lost her mother very young, but in many other ways she seemed to have had quite a happy, bucolic childhood. She was very supported by her family. She loved them very much. And they don't seem to have stood in her way in terms of her scientific ambitions.
Not at all. Even though in Warsaw, girls could not attend university, and her father encouraged her older brother encouraged her, and she was able to make a pact with one of her older sisters. So she was the youngest of 5 children, and she and this one sister agreed that Marie would work as a governess to help support her sister at school in Paris, where she would become a medical doctor, and then when she was established as a doctor, it would be Marie's turn to go to school, and that's how they managed it.
And her father also, he seemed just a very supportive dad who was always there for her. She wrote to him very often. Can you tell us more about him?
He was a physics and mathematics teacher at a boys' gymnasium, and being very proudly Polish, he got into some argument with the Russian director of the school, so he lost that job, and his wife had died of TB, so her care was expensive, going to a sanitarium here or there for the last few years of her life had really impoverished them. So they were all living crowded together, so crowded, in fact, and taking in boys as boarders, student boarders, that typhus broke out in the apartment, and one of the sisters died of that. So she lost her mother and this sister who died at age 14. So there was grief in her life from a very young age, and she was very serious. You know, I have scientist friends who've read this book, women who say, yeah, when we get together, we talk about science, but then we say, oh, I really like your shoes. Or, and you get the feeling that Marie would never have gone there. And I think that's true. Yeah.
But she did, I mean, so the next part of her life, she moves to Paris, and then describe what happens to her there. Describe her meeting of Pierre Curie and how that romance developed.
So there she was, a foreign student in Paris, but still managed to come in first in the exams. And it wasn't until she was quite well along in her second graduate degree, she had an opportunity to take on a project for the French steel industry, to compare different types of steel to see which one would make the best magnets. And someone she knew suggested that she speak to this older, experienced physicist who was an expert in magnetism, and that was Pierre. And to their great surprise, they were interested in each other. I love the fact that the French word for magnet is the same as the word for lover, and it just worked out that way for them. And she had a plan to go back to Poland with her education and to be a teacher like her parents. And then she just felt that she and Pierre could not be separated. And there was a greater likelihood of her pursuing her science in Paris. And so, as she told her family, although it was a great grief to her to remain forever in Paris, that's what she chose to do.
Yeah, she did seem very unhappy, the idea of it, even though she did have Pierre. And the other thing that stands out about that early part of her career, which was a surprise to me because, you know, when you think about women scientists of that era, you imagine it's just obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, that they're always fighting against things. And she was to some extent, but by and large, she did get to pursue her scientific interests quite well, even when she had a baby.
Well, from the beginning, she was recognized for her ability, which is great. It doesn't always happen. And it was one of her, well, all her professors were men, but it was one of them who chose her for this project. And he, in choosing her, told her that it might be a good topic for a doctoral dissertation. So he was already thinking that she could go that far, which was remarkable, since no other woman had done it. So she must have been mighty impressive.
Yeah, and I mean, she did have very supportive people, like I just said. So she had her family, and Pierre was also there, and he never seems to have underestimated her.
No, was ever her booster. And then, as you mentioned, they had a child, and within a month of the child's birth, Pierre's mother died, and so his father offered to move in with them and take care of the baby so Marie could work. Well, that's a situation that most women don't have, and I did see a statistic that in the United States, 40% of women scientists drop out when they have a baby because they can't get good childcare. So she had all that support too.
Yeah. So that is a kind of exhortation to all the fathers-in-law out there.
Yes.
to get out and start doing some of the childcare. So in 1906, very sadly, and this is one of the saddest parts of the book, it really is heartbreaking. Pierre died in this very sudden accident, and it devastated her. But at the same time, it also allowed her to take over his laboratory, to then take up his professorship, which I'd love to know your thoughts on whether that would have happened otherwise, whether she would have ever become a professor if he hadn't passed away that way. And it was in that role that then she became able to hire other women within her lab. So tell us that journey. Do you think that she would ever have been made a professor if Pierre hadn't passed away?
No, I don't. So this great grief in her life was also a remarkable opportunity because everyone around them recognized that she was the only person capable of taking over their lab. And she was offered that immediately. And then also his course. So at the Sorbonne, which is by this point several centuries old, there's never been a woman on the faculty. And she's offered this position. So it made her triply remarkable. They had already won a Nobel Prize in 1903, so she was already world famous. Now she's the only woman in the world who's director of a lab and a professor of physics. So she herself became a magnet for other women.
And tell us more about that. So here she is running this lab. Everyone around the world knows her name. She's been covered in all newspapers. She complains about the attention that she's getting from reporters and people coming to her home and her laboratory all the time. Do you think it was deliberate on her part that she wanted to nurture women, that she wanted to accept them, or was she just not thinking about that? Was she just focused on getting good people and it didn't really matter?
I think at first she was just not even sure she could manage doing this. For the year after his death, she kept a journal in which she spoke to Pierre. And that is the most remarkable document. And she says that she's been offered his position and that she's accepted it. But she honestly doesn't know if perhaps she's crazy to take this on. But at the same time, she feels maybe it's the only way she can carry on. So she's doing this, and then within months of his death, a woman arrives from Canada to work for her. And it's not that she was looking for anyone at that point. She had very poor lab space, no room. But if someone super qualified showed up, she said, "Come on in." So this was the first woman, Harriet Brooks, who came from Canada and had worked with two of the other people really interested in the new physics, Ernest Rutherford and J.J. Thomson. And Harriet Brooks proved herself extremely capable, and Marie wanted her to stay on, offered her a fellowship to keep her, but she got married and dropped out, and then convinced herself that women were ill-suited to science.
Which is very strange, because the first person she was engaged to, she didn't marry because she wanted to continue doing science.
Yes,
and
so she wanted to continue teaching at Barnard. And Barnard told her that if she got married, she would have to resign. So she resigned before getting married, and then she broke the engagement. And then she traveled and went to Paris to work for Madame Curie. And she did very interesting work, but married another suitor, and then did not do any kind of science ever again. But she was invited to speak to the McGill Alumni Association about her experiences in the Curie lab. And that's where she said that science really wasn't for women.
I did find that very strange. How did she interpret that, though? I mean, was she trying to justify her own choices?
That's what I think, but I can't. In writing this book, I tried not to conclude anything about anyone's feelings unless the person expressed those feelings. But I think that was it. I think she had a lot of guilt for having given up the remarkable opportunities she had and had to explain herself.
And do you think there's also an aspect of the bar being so high for women scientists that if you didn't reach it, that somehow you felt that you were even more inadequate than if a man hadn't reached that same bar, that you had to be like Curie in order to justify having a career in science at all?
Well, I think some people today feel that way, for sure. Or some people often say, although she is named as a role model by many people, that maybe the bar is too high. I mean, do you have to make 2 earth-shattering discoveries worthy of 2 Nobel Prizes in order to be a woman in science? No. But that's the sense people have of her. Yeah, I don't know about Harriet Brooks, what was really going on in her mind, but she gave it up.
So Harriet was the first of very many women who
Yes.
passed through her lab. And while Marie did work with some of them, many of these women were also disappointed that they didn't get to work directly with Marie Curie because they'd gone there especially, and she was this very famous figure. In fact, so many left by 1912 that there were no women working there at all by then.
Right, because she was very ill. And so she lost more than a year in the lab. And fortunately, she recovered.
And in that period of time then, who were the characters that really stood out for you as a writer? Who spoke to you when you were researching them?
In the period when she was ill or altogether?
Or up until 1912, so when there were still women coming to the
Ellen
lab.
Gleditsch is really one of the stars of the story. So she was the 3rd woman who came to work in the lab. And she came from Norway and had no experience with radio elements, but that didn't matter. She was a pharmacist. She knew chemistry. They put her to work immediately, and she distinguished herself, eventually earned a doctoral degree, and went back to Norway and became the first person to teach the new science of radioactivity in that country, and eventually became a full professor, although that took a long time because she was a woman.
And did it surprise you, this history? Because I have to confess, even as someone who's written about this topic, that often the people we have uppermost in our mind when we're thinking about scientific history are the most famous people. And I think I imagined, maybe because I'd seen photographs of the Solvay conferences and others, that Marie was the only one.
Right. She was the only woman in the room, yes.
Well, yeah, if it was a room of the luminaries, she was the only one. But in science, as a discipline much more broadly, there are actually very many women, even at that time, or at least that's the impression that you get.
Yes, I think that's the point I wanted to make with this story, that she was never the only one. She didn't want to be the only one. Women have always been interested in science for the same reasons men are, because it's intrinsically interesting. They just didn't get the opportunities. And once she was in place, she didn't keep anyone else from having an opportunity, which was the really great thing about her.
And in some ways, I think Curie's success then can be explained by her circumstances, in that she had this very supportive family, this supportive dad, supportive husband. She was in Paris at the Sorbonne where she was allowed to do her research. So in some sense, that explains why she was the exception, because a lot of women didn't have that perfect confluence of factors.
Yes, and she had also put the work in and excelled everywhere, and had the courage to take on this new phenomenon that most physicists weren't interested in. Something that she chose for her doctoral research, uranic rays, not nearly as sexy as X-rays, which everybody was interested in. But she took them on, and that led to the discoveries of 2 new elements. And then she was unstoppable.
So we're up to 1912 now, and it won't have escaped anyone's attention then that the war is upcoming. Tell us about the role that she played in the war, because it was quite remarkable. And again, this brought a lot of women under her tutelage.
Yeah, I think this was the most remarkable thing of all to me about her life, that when World War I started, her first thought was, this is the first time it will be possible to X-ray the wounded. So I will outfit a mobile X-ray unit. She got someone to give her a car. She didn't even know how to drive. She was given a car, which she filled with X-ray equipment and drove around where it was needed, and convinced the army to let her drive to the front, to the field hospitals. She, over the course of the war, she personally outfitted 19 of these cars, and because she couldn't be everywhere at once, she created a course for women who wanted to do this work. It was a 6-week course in electricity, X-rays, and human anatomy. And she trained 150 women to go out and do this work. She had taken her 17-year-old daughter with her on these very dangerous missions. And Irène also, in addition to studying physics and chemistry, also got a nursing degree during the war so that she could perform this work independently, and was a teacher in the course, even though she would have been too young to take the course if she hadn't been Madame Curie's daughter.
And I think we have to talk about her daughters at some length, because they were so important to her, especially after Pierre died, that they were so central to her life. Right?
Yes, and the 3 of them had a tremendous bond, even though the younger girl was not at all interested in science, and made jokes about herself, how she didn't quite fit in that family. But they just adored each other, and the record is in the letters, which Marie saved all of their letters, they saved her letters, and so that was one of the richest sources for me to be able to quote from the letters about their relationship with each other.
And one thing that did intrigue me, and I really do want to ask you about this, because you don't dwell on it in the book, but I feel that it was a subtext there, that when Irène met the man that she was going to marry, that Marie was not impressed. She didn't seem into him at all.
Yeah, she was impressed enough to hire him, but a son-in-law, I think mostly, and this is the younger daughter, so it's not my surmise, but the younger daughter felt she just didn't want to lose her, didn't want to lose the closeness.
Well, that's very sad.
It all worked out.
Yeah, it did. And actually they became then very successful in their own right.
They
both
were very
won Nobel
successful,
Prizes.
and Marie and Fred, the son-in-law, really, really grew to love each other. Yeah.
So we have to remember that she lived through one of the most exhilarating periods of time in the history of physics. You know, this is when all the big discoveries were being made, or at least it felt that way. And she was personal friends with many of these giants of physics like Ernest Rutherford, Albert Einstein. What would it have been like for her to be part of a community like this?
Well, she said it herself from one of these, you mentioned the Solvay Council. So these were meetings of the top physicists in the world. It was invitation only. And, and they met about every 3 years. And from 1911, the first one, until 1933, she was the only woman invited. So you see these pictures of the group, and there she is. So from one of the meetings, she wrote home to the girls how happy she was to be talking physics with all these lovers of science. It was just, that was her community of pals. Yeah.
And does she ever, I mean, you read her archive at length, you've read everything she's written, everything that's been written about her. Does she ever dwell on the fact that she was the only woman in that room? Does she think about it very much?
No, she doesn't mention it. Yeah.
And what do you make of that then?
It was normal for her. I mean, I think she was the odd one out in so many ways her whole life. I think she got used to it.
And was there any part of her that ever reflected on the opportunities that she didn't get because she was a woman? So I'm thinking here particularly in 1911. So this is the year that she won her second Nobel Prize, but before she had won that second prize, she lost the vote that would have seen her elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences, which is a huge honour, not an easy thing to get, but certainly she was qualified. I mean, she was about to get a second Nobel Prize, and she lost it.
Right. They could not overcome immutable tradition. That was the reason. And it was ridiculous because the Academy needed her as a member. She was a world expert on radioactivity. And how were their members supposed to judge other papers or prizes if they didn't have her there to give her opinion? But she never commented on losing the chance to join, and she never put herself forward as a candidate again. And then her daughter actively tried. So her daughter is also a Nobel Prize winner and has this whole history and tried 3 times and didn't get in.
Can you explain that then? Why were they so resistant? What was happening inside these academies? I know the academies of Europe, the scientific academies, were always very resistant to accepting women. I don't think the Royal Society admitted them to.
But not as bad as the French one,
right?
Because she was a foreign member of the Italian, the German, the British, the American Philosophical Society. I mean, she had foreign memberships in all of these. And in fact, one of her supporters in arguing for her election was pointing out that the other academies in Europe were beginning to accept women, and that usually France led the way, and now they had better get with it, but it didn't work.
And it is interesting, when she was traveling the world, you describe how effusive people were. And they wanted to meet her, you know, that if she came to, whenever she came to the US, there were just crowds everywhere. She was being given, she was being given honorary degrees left, right and centre. Every place wanted to see her. And yet in France, it feels like every time she went back, she didn't have the resources that she needed. She didn't always have the space or the recognition. How was it?
I think it got better in France. I mean, she turned that inadequate lab into a world-renowned research institute that people came to from the Far East even. So it was the Academy, I think, more than, because she certainly had loyal male friends, supporters. The way she got the work of her lab published in the proceedings of the French Academy of Sciences was to have one of her friends present it. But that's what she had to do, because as a non-member, she couldn't present. But the real reason she was seen as such a humanitarian was the use of radium as a treatment for cancer. So even people who had no understanding of the science that she had been involved in, they understood that she was the discoverer of that, and that was all they needed to know.
And there was also a tension in as much as people knew that Pierre and her had worked together, and there was sometimes the assumption that he had been kind of the lead investigator, she had been his assistant. How did she receive that?
It isn't known how she received it, but it sure happened a lot, and it still happens. And constantly, when a couple work together, it's just assumed that the man is really the scientist and the woman is just the assistant. And she had a friend in England who was also a physicist, married to a physicist. And in their case, this was Hertha Ayrton, she and her husband intentionally did different things so that no one could say that he had really done her work, because he was doing something completely different.
And there have been men in history who've taken the credit for their wives' work.
No.
But Pierre is not that person, right?
Pierre is not that person.
He was quite the opposite, actually. He seemed very keen to make sure that she always got the credit for what she did.
Yes, and in fact, they had been nominated for the Nobel Prize from the first one in 1901. And when the nomination really went all the way in 1903, he learned that he alone was going to share the prize with Henri Becquerel. And he wrote to the committee and said, no, if I am named, I would like to be named with Madame Curie, as we have done the work. Yeah.
Now, later in life, and I think, I think one of the heartbreaking things about reading this book is once Pierre died, there seemed to be a sadness that never really left her. And when you quote other people who are meeting her for the first time, for instance, they very often observe how sad she looks, how weak she looks, how frail she is. And there also did seem to be a kind of morbid fatalism that settled on her, especially later in her life, in her midlife. So once when she was coalescing, I noticed she was watching silkworms in a jar. So she was lying down, she was convalescing. Her daughter, I think, was keeping silkworms in a jar. She was watching them, and she said, each of us must spin our own cocoon. Mm-hmm. It's just so profound and sad at the same time. Was it the death of Pierre that made her feel that way? Was it the effect of the radium? What was it that brought this kind of sad, dark pall over her?
This is just my thinking. But that grief from early age, she just carried a lot of sadness, and it did strike me how people always described her as sad-looking, and that when she smiled, it completely transformed her face. There are no photographs of her smiling, but there is film footage of people leaving one of the Solvay Council meetings, just coming out the building. I think Irving Langmuir had brought a camera, had an early movie camera, and when she comes out of the building, she's laughing. She is really having fun talking to those lovers of physics. And just, so she did know how to smile. Yeah.
And what was that like for you then, writing about this character? Because I guess as a biographer, you're trying to bring out someone's character. She is so remarkable in so many ways, so brilliant, and with an obvious passion for her life, a passion for her daughters, for her lab, and yet this constant sadness underneath. How did you interpret that? How did you try and write it?
I didn't feel I needed to interpret it, just to present it, and she makes that possible because there are so many surviving letters where she talks about her thoughts, her feelings. I found her inspirational. I can't say I was inspired by her as a child, but certainly as an adult, I was inspired by her sense of personal responsibility, respect for her, for just never sinking into despair. Although she had reason, she just didn't give in. She always thought, what can I do? And then she would think of something that she could do, and she did it. And that just, throughout the pandemic, I was alone with Madame Curie, and she was great company. Just, I thought, you know, whatever we're seeing and whatever we're about to see, she lived through a lot of dark times. And her message to me was, you just have to keep doing whatever it is you do.
That's beautiful. And so tell us more about the process then. We're going to go to questions soon, but I'm just curious as another writer. How was it for you? It took you 4 years to write this book.
Right.
How did you write it? How did you get the material?
Well, the first thing that happened was my trip to Paris was canceled by the pandemic and the lockdown. But then I discovered that virtually everything of hers was available online, even the grief journal, the handwritten grief journal. You can read the whole thing on the French National Library System website. So that was great. The lab notebooks, everything is there. And then there were records kept from the time she finally got a secretary during the First World War. And the secretary kept records of who came to work in the lab. So the Curie Museum had all these names. 45 women. This was the thing. This was the inspiration, because I came very late to the issue of women in science. So I had that. I had some letters of theirs. A couple of them, Harriet Brooks and Ellen Gleditch, are the subjects of biographies themselves. So I had that material. And I had the volumes of collected letters of Marie and her daughters. So those were the things. Oh, and then the papers, the weekly proceedings of the French Academy of Sciences, the papers and biographies of people like Rutherford and Einstein and Max Planck, Niels Bohr, all of those folks. I mean, she lived through a second revolution in science, and it was radioactivity that opened the atom to scrutiny. So the number of surprises and things that were learned in her lifetime is just staggering. And she grew along with all of that knowledge. So I gathered all of that. I kept notes. I thought about how to tell the science, how to tell the story. Telling the science, telling what they did in the lab was very important to me. That's the part that's left out of a lot of the biographies. But yeah, I mean, that's the main thing, right? That's what animated her.
And it is beautiful. I mean, how the way you weave through the science at the same time as telling her story. And it really does carry it along, because you need to know that in order to understand the relevance that her work had, why people were so excited about it, why the context for it later. And in fact, a lot of her first-hand materials, her diaries, everything, they're radioactive.
They probably still are. I only, a few weeks ago, saw my first actual documents. So I was at an annual meeting of the American Philosophical Society, and the librarian had gone through their archives, because she was a member, and sure enough, they had 2 handwritten letters from her. And I was thrilled to see that. And then I told them that they really needed to have someone bring in a Geiger counter. and they're doing that, yeah.
So just finally then, she succumbed to that radiation in the end.
Yes, and it wasn't just the radioactivity. Right. It was very likely the X-ray exposure, because all through the war, she is X-raying people all day long, and she's wearing a cotton smock. So.
Yeah. And it is quite sad also to read her learning about other people passing away, people that she's worked with, passing away as a result of radioactivity, which she herself had a role in discovering.
Yes. And that guilt, I imagine that, again, she doesn't talk about it, but when the dial painter's story, the very sad story of the young women who painted the glowing numbers on watch faces and instrument dials, and they were using paint that actually contained radium, and they were told to bring the paintbrush to a point by passing it through their lips. And when she learned about that, was how the terrible lethal effects of radium came to light. It was this awful overexposure from the ingestion of radium. And of course, she had never advocated putting it in paint. That was not her idea of what to do with radium. So realizing that and just feeling such empathy for these young women, and she did write a letter saying that she felt that they deserved justice and compensation. But it was too late for them. And then there she was, so much older. She had tremendous exposure herself, and she wasn't sick. So it was very questionable. Ellen Gleditch lived to be 88. It's very hard to explain the differences from person to person. I mean, most of them did die of something related to radiation exposure.
I feel like we've had a whirlwind tour of Marie Curie's life. It's just wonderful to hear you talk about it, and with such passion. We've got these wonderful questions from the audience, though, so I'll just use the remaining time to go through these. So the first one is, why did Marie Curie get the recognition she truly deserved in ways that other women scientists, like Rosalind Franklin, who was later, did not get that recognition in their lifetimes?
Yeah, well, that's a giant question. But I actually think things got more difficult later. That in a way, Marie Curie opened doors, but a lot of them slammed shut after her. And, Rosalind Franklin, Jocelyn Bell Burnell. There are lots of women who, Lisa Meitner, we wish had gotten a lot more credit or part of a Nobel Prize, and they just didn't. So this is an ongoing struggle.
And it does feel, if you read Rosalind Franklin's biography, she was surrounded by people constantly kind of stabbing her in the back. Yeah. At least Marie didn't have that.
Right. Even in the double helix. The way James Watson spoke about her, it's just so demeaning. Something about how he wished she'd take off her glasses and do something with her hair. Who says that about it?
People still say that about women scientists, sadly. Another question here. Did Marie Curie ever attend a single-sex school at any point during her education? Has that experience been formative for the most accomplished women scientists of her generation?
Say the second part again, please.
The going to a single-sex school. And I didn't go to a single-sex school myself, but I have heard from other women scientists who did that was really formative for them. Do you think it is?
She, her primary school was all girls, and but probably that was her only single-sex school experience. I too did not go to a single-sex school, but I got to teach for a while at Smith, and while I was there, I thought, "Oh my, this is really nice," And I think a lot of young women go through a phase where they're really challenged by the male students, and at a single-sex school, that doesn't happen, and they have time to build up their confidence in a way that may really be helpful. At the same time, there was a lot of talk about triggering and not saying anything to them that might trigger. And I thought, wait a minute, are they going to the outside world after this experience? So that's a digression. Let's get to more questions.
Okay. Were there any women you couldn't fit in the book?
Yes. And I've been criticized for not telling more about certain ones among the group, but that was only because the amount of information just isn't there. Some of these records don't even... Lucy Blanquier, who was the second woman who came, even her date of birth and death is not known. So it's a fragmentary record. I did the best I could.
And Brian White writes, I'm sorry, I didn't read the other names because there were none. If there is a name, I'll read it. He writes, science communication is vital for our society. How do you reach an audience that needs it, not just an audience that wants it?
I don't know. And believe me, that is a question much on my mind. Yes, yeah.
We were talking about this earlier, that you edit a poetry column for Scientific American. What is that like? What made you want to do that?
I love poetry about science. I've been interested in it for, gosh, probably about 50 years, ever since I met Diane Ackerman when she was a graduate student at Cornell, and she was writing a cycle of poems about the planets. She'd gotten Carl Sagan to agree to give her an hour a day as a tutor because he was so intrigued with the idea of poetry about the planets. And she wrote this gorgeous book of poems, but she was also writing a doctoral dissertation about scientific poetry, including people like John Donne. So that really got me interested. And so about 6 years ago, I approached Scientific American because I learned that in their very first issues in 1845, they had included poetry. So I asked if they would consider publishing it again, and if so, could I be the editor? And it worked, you know? Just sometimes you suggest something, look what happens. So a lot of people, and the poems are really about science. You can't just take a word like entanglement and use it to talk about your mother. It's...
I feel like you've had a lot of poems like that.
I get a lot of poems like that.
Okay, another question here. Did attending the Bronx High School of Science influence your becoming a science writer?
I'm sure it did. I wish that was the most wonderful educational experience. I actually thanked 3 of my high school teachers in the credits to this book, including my French teacher. If you've ever seen the Bronx High School of Science, there's a big mural over the front entrance that depicts the history of science. There's only one woman in the picture, and of course, it's Madame Curie. But no one... So at the Bronx High School of Science, I had electives in writing, creative writing, and nobody ever talked to me about science writing. And I think it's because they were as ignorant as I was, that there was such a thing. And even in college. So I just was lost. I kept taking science courses, but couldn't picture myself as a bench chemist. And I had to fall into it backwards afterwards. And But again, I have thought back to what was made available to me at the Bronx High School of Science, and I'm ever grateful. And just this week, I still have a couple of friends from that long ago, and we were talking about just how wonderful it was. And she said even her college education wasn't as good.
Next question. How much literary license do you allow yourself, like inventing conversations? I suspect not
None.
Inventing conversations.
None, no. In fact, that was my one complaint about Eve's biography of her mother. There's a lot of invented conversation, but at least it's clear. You know, when the conversation is in the flow of the text, you know she's remembering it. It went sort of like this. But then there are things that are quoted from letters, and that's the real deal. Yeah, I don't like it. I hate it when I see it in another book. It really turned me off at reading something if I come across that. I mean, why would you do that?
There is a degree of creative license that you have to take in as much as you are selecting things.
Selection, right? Yes. That is huge, because you can slant something one way or another by what you choose to leave out or emphasize. And you can't help that. Everybody has a bias. I'm a great fan of hers. I don't try to hide it. I would hate to write about somebody I didn't like. I don't know if I could.
But you eulogize her. You are very honest. It's not as though you're keeping anything back from us. We see the sadness and the weakness and the not so much the failures, but you know the problems that she's having as well. That she's not a perfect individual.
No.
Okay. What is it like seeing adaptations of your books? And this person writes, they just saw Galileo's Daughter in Cambridge.
Oh, that's not really an adaptation of my book. That's a case of a stolen title. I think you can't copyright a title. So I've gotten a few letters from people who ask me am I pleased with. I haven't seen it. I don't know. I understand that it's a character in the play is a journalist who reads the daughter's letters and goes to Italy. Well, that was my life experience, but I really don't know anything about the play. I was asked, there was an earlier play by a different playwright, and I was asked to see it and to give permission to use the title. And I saw it and I didn't like it and I didn't give permission. But that was 20 years ago. Things have changed, you know. People don't ask permission anymore. That's what I've learned. There was a play based on Longitude, which I didn't see, but I have read. And in that case, several experts from the Greenwich Observatory went to see it and said it was really good. So I gave permission. And then I read it. And what struck me about the play was that the explanation of longitude, of how to determine it, was wrong. And I thought, how did that get by all those experts? And they said, well, you know, there was music, there was a lot going on. So, you know, what I've learned in life is that there's very little that you can control. You know, once the book goes out there, that's it. Yeah.
Dava, thank you so much. This really is such a remarkable, beautiful book, and you know from listening to her that she has not skipped over a detail. She hasn't got any of the science wrong. The science is all very, very accurate. So can we have a big round of applause for Dava Sobel? Wonderful. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.